Hello, dear friends. I'd like to say a few things about parshat Shmot. There are multiple issues in parshat Shmot, and I would like to talk about one which is mentioned in the Midrash. I have a bit of laryngitis today, so please excuse me. So the Midrash says, "Bizchut nashim tzidkaniot yatsa Yisrael miMitzrayim," which means that by the merit of righteous women was the Jewish people able to exodus Egypt. So the normal explanation that the Midrash itself gives, it quotes a verse in Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, tapuach or articha, underneath the fruit tree did I arouse you. And the Midrash says that when Paro said that he wanted to kill all the firstborn males, so the men said to their wives, we shouldn't have any children. We're almost like an accomplice. And the women said, what do you mean? You'll be accomplice to Paro, because Paro only said to kill the males. And if we don't have any children, we're going to stop the females as well. And this way, they were able to convince their husbands to continue to have children for the Jewish people. However, in the whole perikopa, the whole parsha of Shmot, we see this primary or central task of women within the redemptive process. And there are 6 women who are mentioned in this week's parsha who are active in the redemptive process. So the first ones, of course, are Shifra and Pua. Shifra and Pua, of course, according to the Midrash, are Yocheved and Miriam. But if we go according to the simple meaning of the text, it appears that they're 2 different people because Yocheved and Miriam will be introduced later. So Shifra and Pua, they save the Jewish children because Paro told them to make sure that the males, will be killed. And they decide not to do that. And if he looks in the text about Shifra and Pua, it says, of course, that Paro decided that the Jews might become a 5th column. And he turns towards these 2 women, Shifra and Pua. And he says, when you see them giving birth, if it is a male, put him to death. If it's a woman, she can live. But because they feared God, these midwives said to Paro, they didn't do it, basically. They had to give an excuse. So they said, well, these Hebrew women are not like the Egyptians. Even before we show up to do our job as midwives, they've already given birth. It's interesting, by the way, that the term that is used is chayot, hena, chayot. And now Rashi actually brings a midrash about chayot, which literally means wild animals. They're like people who live in the wild. They can do it themselves. However, there's a deeper aspect here, because if you look at Onkelos, the famous translator of the Torah for the 1st century into Aramaic, every time it says miyaldot, which means midwives, he translates it into Aramaic as chayata, meaning those who bring life. So if in Aramaic, a miyaledet, a midwife, is a chayata, so when the text actually says instead of miyaldot that the Hebrews are chayot, it probably comes from the Aramaic word, which is close to Hebrew, of chayata, meaning they're like midwives themselves. But yes, it's a term which you could play around. It's a double entendre. There are, on the one hand, they are like midwives themselves. On the other hand, they're like wild animals in the sense that they know how to do it themselves. They don't need the professional. It's something they're accustomed to within their families, where they have learned to, under the duress of being slaves, to do it by themselves. How to be understood. By the way, interestingly enough, Onkelos, who normally translates mialedet as chayata, when it comes to the word that the Bible uses after about the Hebrews, that they are chayot, which he could have also translated as chayata if it does come from the Aramaic, he translates as chakimaya, that they are wise. So the simple meaning could be they're wise, meaning they're wise enough that they have able to learned how to cope and to gain this ability and this talent by themselves. But it's interesting that why would a miyaledet, somebody who brings a child into the world, called the wise one? Well, it says in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers, Ezeu Chacham, who is the wise one, Haroet Hanolad, who literally means who can see the future. But the literal meaning of Nolad is can see what is being born. So the miyaledet, the midwife, is the one who can see what is being born. This is an important point, which I'm going to come back to later. But these are the first two of the 6 women who are mentioned in Parshat Shmot, who are saving the Jewish people by saving the children. Of course, by saving the male children, they're also saving Moshe, who is going to be, of course, the Goel, the savior who will take them out of Egypt under God's command and as the emissary. Then the next story we have, of course, right after this Chayata, is Yocheved and Miriam, meaning Moses' mother and Moses' sister, who after Moses is born, and they're afraid because Paro said that basically everybody can kill the male child. And once you say everybody, then there are always people who don't like these Hebrews. And then they decide to hide him for 3 months in the Nile. And the daughter is looking out for him. And then the daughter of Paro shows up, and so we have 3 women here: Yocheved, the mother, Miriam, the sister, and the daughter of Paro. The Midrash gives the name Batya, which is interesting, which literally means daughter of God, which, by the way, sometimes the Hebraized names, because I'm assuming she did not have a Hebrew name, could be a Hebraization of what her Egyptian name. Since the pharaohs saw themselves as gods, so that would mean that the daughter of the pharaoh in Egyptian would mean something like a daughter of a god. So it very could be that in Egyptian it meant something like Batya, which in Hebrew means the daughter of God. But anyhow, get back to this point, which is an important point. I'm not saying no. So you have Yocheved, Miriam, and the daughter of Paro, who saved Moshe, who is going to be the Redeemer. Now I'll mention one other thing once we talked about names. When Moshe is saved by the daughter of Paro, she wants to give him a name. And it says in the Torah, she calls him Moshe. Kimin Hamaim Mishitihu, because I drew him from the water. Now that would make sense if he had the Hebrew name Moshe. But assuming that Bat Paro did not know Hebrew, and I think that's a good assumption, and she probably spoke in Egyptian, what could she have said that the Torah translated, he is now the child of the water? Well, if you remember, and we have this, of course, in the Haftorah of Parshat Va'era, that the Pharaoh saw in the Egyptian pantheon, the Nile was one of the gods of Egypt. By the way, in the book of Bereshit, in Genesis, when Joseph comes to hear Pharaoh's dream, in the dream, Pharaoh dreams that he was above the Nile. And he's a little bit embarrassed to say that publicly, that he dreamed he's above the Nile, because the Nile is one of the gods of Egypt. And of course, Pharaoh in his arrogance considers himself the greatest god of Egypt. So when he tells the dream to Joseph, he says, I was standing beside the Nile. Just to point that out. So the Nile is one of the gods of Egypt. Just like the crocodiles are a Nile in Egypt. And we read in the Haftorah of next week of Va'era, where the prophet calls Pharaoh the great crocodile in the Nile. So what does it mean that his name is Moses and I drew him from the Nile? Remember, Pharaoh, at least what assumption is Pharaoh's, you have, his name is Ramses. Ramses, so means the son of Ra. Ra, of course, the sun god, is one of the gods of the pantheon of Egypt. Ra-Moses, which means the child of the sun god. Now, if Moses' name is Moses, Moses, it would mean the son of. Moses is the son of, in Egyptian. So the son of what? Son of the Nile, which is exactly what it says in the Hebrew. Minamayim shitiu, I'm calling Moshe because I drew him the Nile, but the Hebrew says masha, which means to draw, limsha, to draw. So he was drawn from the Nile. So he's sort of like the son from the Nile. And Egyptian probably meant the son of, and here the son of is the son of the Nile, which would make sense because in Pharaoh's house, if you're the son of the Nile, it also gives you special status. Is this one of the names of the pantheon of Egypt? So we have so far 5 women who are involved both in saving Jewish children and in saving the Redeemer. So Shifra and Puah, the midwives, Yocheved, the mother, Miriam, the sister, and Bat Paro, and of course the daughter of Pharaoh. And then there's one more, and that's Moses' wife, Zipporah. And this is a very unusual one. Because about Zipporah, the story goes in chapter 4, verse 24. Vahi baderech mamalon, as Moses is going with Zipporah and their children, and they just had their second son, Eliezer. And they stop off at some type of place to stay over, some type of inn on the way. Vayifkasheu Hashem, and God met up with them, which sometimes means an angel. Vayivakesh hamito, and he wanted to kill him. Now there's a question here. Who did the angel want to kill? Was it Moses or was it the child? It's not clear. From this point, it looks like it was Moses, because it says he met him in the inn and wanted to kill him. From the rest of the story, it could be the child. By the way, if it's Moses, and in the end, he doesn't kill him, because it was just a warning about to make sure his son would be circumcised. We have here a second story similar to the Akedah, where Abraham brings Isaac to Mount Moriah, supposedly for an offering, but the offering never happens. Their offering becomes the ram instead of Isaac. Just like Abraham knew that God had promised him, Kibi Yitzchaki Karela Chazera, that your seed will continue through Isaac. And all of a sudden, he's supposed to do this strange ceremony in Mount Moriah, which is called an olah, an offering. He's wondering what's going on. Is God going to ask me to offer my son when I get to Mount Moriah? Is that what it's all about? He doesn't know, but he keeps going. And in the end, God tells him, no, this was just a test. Possibly, this is what's happening with Moses too. He's going as a redeemer of Egypt, and now nothing makes sense. It's almost like you have to go through the point of where nothing makes sense in order to come out the other side and be more motivated. If, of course, according to the way many explain, that who God wanted to kill was Eliezer, the child, which is very possible. But still, even according to both explanations, whether it's Moshe or Eliezer, in the end, the reason seems to be because Eliezer was not circumcised, because Moses, according to Rashi, the Midrash, was afraid that it's a long trip. Maybe I should wait till I come back. And Zipporah steps up, and she takes a flint, a stone, and she circumcises her son. And finally, and the angel leaves. And she says, Ki chatan tamim atali. You are, chatan, of course, is like a husband. You are a blood husband to me. And again, the question is, was she saying this to the child Eliezer, meaning that I almost lost my husband because of you? Or was she saying to Moshe, because the angel almost killed Eliezer? Vayirich mimenu. So, as I said, the angel left. She said, Chatan tamim lamulot. There are many ways to explain this. Chatan tamim, again, a bridegroom of blood for those who are circumcised. And there are different ways to translate this. Rashi says, Atayita gorem liot chatan sheli nerzach. Means she's talking to the child. You almost killed my husband. And but then she says, Chatan damim lamulot, that you almost killed my husband because of the milah. That's the way Rashi interpreted it. And I'll leave it at that at the moment because that's not our main idea here. But we see here that it's Sipporah again saves Moshe, according to Rashi for sure. That Moshe was almost killed. And as I said, according to the Rashi's interpretation, you have a sort of similarity to the Akedah with Abraham and Isaac. With the father and the child. In this case, of course, the father is almost killed, not the child. Unless you understand it's the child. But in this case, of course, without the father, nothing would happen. Does that mean we would have never left Egypt? Maybe we would have a few hundred years later when somebody else came around who could do the job. But so in that sense, with Abraham, Yitzchak was supposed to be the continuation. And that's why the danger was if Yitzchak would die. With Moses was the one who was supposed to take them out of Egypt. So if Moses died, that would have been tragic. And all these women are saving Moshe. Shifra and Puah, his mother, his sister, the daughter of Paro, and Tzipporah. And therefore, for sure, you can say, Bizchut Nashim Tzadkaniyot, by the merit of righteous children, of righteous women, did we leave Egypt? Because you have right away in the first parsha, 6 righteous women, that without them, this would have not happened, at least not according to the narrative that we know. What is the place of women as far as the redemption is concerned? I want to go back to another point, which is associated with women, and that's called the well. Miriam later on becomes a central figure in the Exodus story. She dances around on the Red Sea and gets all the women behind her to sing the song that the men had sung at the Red Sea, maybe in addition to what everybody sang at the Red Sea. The Talmud says that there was water that there was a well that used to nourish the people of Israel. It was a moving well, a miraculous well, which could mean that they kept finding wells, or it could mean it's a miraculous well. Since I don't know what a miraculous well is, I'll just assume that's one of the possibilities. But it says that well that kept feeding the Jews water, the Israelites water, I should say, was really by the merit of Miriam, neither Moses or Aaron, but the merit of Miriam. Why is the well connected to the woman? Well, a well represents water, because in Hebrew, be'er is be'er mayim chayim, which means a well of a living well, a fountain, which emerges, a spring, which comes out of the ground. So it's be'er mayim chayim. It's a constant well which is springing out of the ground. And therefore it gives life. And the woman brings life into the world, brings the child. So the woman is called the well in that sense. If we go back to the patriarchs, of course, about Abraham, we don't know, but Abraham dug wells. And he dug wells. He had 7 wells that he dug with Abimelech. But then the wells become associated specifically with the woman. So Isaac, when Abraham sends his servant, the Midrash says was Eliezer, to look for a woman for Isaac, he meets this woman, Rebekah, by the well. And when Rebekah comes to meet Isaac, he is in Be'er Lachai Roi, in the area of the well of the God who sees, which is, of course, based on the story of Ishmael, who discovered a well and a spring. And then, of course, Yaakov meets Rachel at the well. Joseph, who is sort of the continuation of Yaakov, maybe could have had the possibility of the well, but because the brothers, there was enmity between him and the brothers. Instead of a well, it says they threw him into a bore, which means an empty pit. And those empty pits were just collecting rainwater. But it says specifically about that bore, about that pit, a bore rake in Bomaim. That pit was empty. It had no water because of the enmity and the divisions. So instead of Be'er, instead of this live spring, you have an empty well. So the wells start with Abraham. Isaac and Jacob, they're associated primarily with the women. But then when the brothers start to battle each other, the well dries up and it becomes an empty pit. When does the well come back? Well, prophecy leaves the Jewish people when they come into Egypt. And there's no prophecy from the time of Joseph all the way to the time of Moses. Now Moses comes and meets Zipporah, his wife, and he meets her at the well, just like Isaac and Jacob did. And with Moses, prophecy comes back. So the well represents life. So it's associated first and foremost with the woman, who is associated with bringing life into the world. That's why she's associated with the well. When the man meets the woman, that's the well, the ability to spring life into this world. But the well is also a spiritual well. And that's why the prophets experienced the well. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. That's the experience of the well. In our tradition, already a concept that is we find it biblically, but it's more developed in the rabbinic literature. We have this concept called Shekhinah, which means God's divine presence. As it says in the Bible, Hashocheni Tam, that God dwells with us even betumatam, even when we are in places of impurity, God is with us, meaning he doesn't leave us even when we sin because he hopes that we come back. And it says, Vasuli mitash v'shachanti b'tocham, make me a temple and I will dwell among them. If they make me a temple, I will dwell among them. So in rabbinic literature, the idea of God dwelling becomes the Shekhinah, the divine presence, and it's always in the feminine. In Kabbalistic literature, this is even more emphasized. The idea of the God's presence in this world has a feminine aspect to it. Now, there's another. The Talmud says, "Kol makom shegalu Yisrael, galta shekhinah imahem." Everywhere the Jews were exiled, the Shekhinah, God's divine presence, was with them. Galta le Mitzrayim, they exiled to Egypt, and God was with them. To Babylonia, God's presence was with them. Greece, Persia, Greece, Rome, God's presence is with them to watch over them. In that sense, the Shekhinah also goes into exile. So there's a lower presence, but there's a presence to watch over the Jewish people during the exile. And the verse in Deuteronomy, chapter 30, Devarim Shloshim, says, "V'shav Hashem Elohecha shvutcha," says that the im yani dechacha b'ktzei hashamayim, even if you will be scattered to the four corners of the heavens, God will take you from there. And it says, "V'shav Hashem Elohecha shvutcha," God will return your exiles. But in Hebrew it says "v'shav," which means God will return with your exiles. So the Talmud says about that is to tell you that the Shekhinah, God's divine presence, goes with the Jews into the exile and comes back to Israel with the Jews who come back to Israel. When the Shekhinah comes back to Israel, because it's not needed anymore in the exile, it goes back to its proper place. And if you remember, in Genesis, when Jacob is about to go down to Egypt to meet Joseph, God appears to him and says, "Don't fear to go down to Egypt. Anochi ered imcha Mitzrayima, I will go down with you to Egypt. V'anochi elcha gamalo, and I will bring you back here too. Bring you back up here, meaning to the land of Canaan, to Israel." In what sense? Jacob dies in Egypt, meaning I'll bring your offspring back too. Because when the Shekhinah goes to down to the exile to watch over the Jews to make sure they don't perish, it also brings them back. This is the idea. God's divine presence is now in Egypt, and the divine presence is the female aspect. So it arouses the females to be the ones who are going to be the facilitators in order to help the Jews make their way out of the exiles. And these 6 women, because of them, Moshe was able to do the task that he had to do. B'zchut nashim tzidkaniyot, Yatzanu Mitzrayim. It's this relationship with the woman, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, which of course is the divine presence, which is the way that we connect to prophecy and also, of course, to the redemptive process, which ultimately leads us back to the land of Israel and the connection, direct connection to God. Shalom, shalom.